Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing. Hey, hey. Testing. Hey, Brecht, how are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you.
Your microphone isn't. Can you test again, please?
Test, 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 test. 1, 2, 3. Test, test, test. Test.
That's
test,
great.
test.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. Hi, my name is Martin. I'm one of the caretakers of the Coven of Wisdom. And because everybody in my team is either at another conference or ill, I have to do both the live stream and the presentation myself. So please bear with me. Yeah, so I have to double click this one and then it goes to that one. And then I have to go back to this computer. And welcome to the Coven of Wisdom CSS meetup. So today we have two incredible speakers. Brecht and Hidde are going to show us, are going to take us to a deep dive with custom properties and popovers and dialogues and all that new stuff coming to the browser. So that's great. Thank you for showing up, eating the pizza, having drinks, having nice conversations. Yeah, so if you're not familiar with the Coven of Wisdom, what we try to do is organize meetups which look over the proverbial technology fence. So today we have a CSS meetup, but other times we have an AI meetup or a Hidde, some sort of PHP commerce framework meetup, all themed with the idea. Okay, let's look over the proverbial fence. Because digital projects aren't just front end, aren't just back end. It's a collaboration between all kinds of teams. Yeah, that's what we try to do with the Coven. I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor. So we're all able to do this with the help of IO. So thanks for that. We have a code of conduct. So you can find it on our website, covenofwisdom.io/code of conduct. So if you feel, we try to nurture a safe environment. So if anything happens, come talk to me and we'll figure stuff out. Yeah, so let's start with our first speaker today. You can find you might know him from such articles on smashing and CSS-tricks, RIP. Brecht de Ruyte. Should I do some cricket sound effects?
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
Point. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we had another event just a few minutes. The hairs on the back of your neck are standing up. I can see them.
All right.
The floor is all yours, Brecht.
All right. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk to you about custom properties. It's very nice to be here. Before I get started, maybe a quick question to all of you. Which of you is actually working as a front-end developer? Can I see some hands? Right, it's quite a lot of you. And who is working with CSS on a day-to-day basis? All right, a few of you. Okay, cool. This is going to be interesting. But first of all, Martin already said a few things. Who's this guy? My name is Brecht. Nice to meet you. Hi. And I am a front-end developer working at IO Campus Ghent, which is in Belgium. I work on a variety of projects from car configurators to web shops, big content websites, small content websites, animations, etc. One time a project manager called me a fluid developer, which is a very nice term to say. We just fling you around from project to project, but let's not go there. Since recently, I've also become a Google developer expert for web technologies, which is fun. I'm looking forward to do a lot more in the community in the future. And part of the reason why I became this is because of my blog, utilityben.com, where I write about a variety of articles, from CSS-related stuff, but also a bit about UX, a little bit about accessibility. I even wrote about how to code on a Chromebook, because it's my personal blog, so why not, I guess. And yeah, of course, as Martin said, I also wrote a bit for Smashing Magazine, CSS-tricks, rest in peace. Fortunately, no guest writers anymore. And the I/O Tech Hub, which is our own tech blog of I/O. If you haven't checked it out, I suggest you do so. Right, enough about me. Custom properties. That was what I'm going to talk about. Let me start off with a bit of good news. Every year, there is a State of CSS survey, and it had some pretty good numbers when it came to custom properties. 93% of the people have used custom properties, and only about 1.3% has never heard of them. I think that's fantastic. So what the hell is this guy doing here, right? This is all basic knowledge that I'm going to tell you, so why am I here? Well, there's a bit more going on. There's also another survey. Well, it's not a survey, it's more data, which is the Web Almanac. And these are the 2022 results, because 2023 isn't there yet. And it shows the depth of these custom properties. And we're only using them in a depth of 0 of 1, as you can see right there. Now, what does this mean? This means that we really don't put custom properties inside of other custom properties. We don't really use a lot of inheritance between them. So, yeah, are we only using them as a constant? Let's take another metric into the account. What are they used for? Because they are used for colors, for background colors, etc. Kind of your basic things that you're going to use for, your constants, right? Your basic colors of your website, etc. That's what you're going to use them for. So, yeah, that's bit bad, so we're kind of using it in a Sass kind of way, as you can see right here. So we all know this little idea of you set a custom property or a variable in Sass, and you just read that out. On the right-hand side, you have the CSS equivalent of that, which is, a bit different, because this is CSS. The browser understands this, right? Sass is a preprocessor, so it gets transformed into CSS. So there is a bit of a difference there, but we're still only using it like that. And you are missing out on a lot of power if you're just using it like that. But why is this? And I've really been thinking about why are we not using them to their full effect. And one of these reasons is, maybe a comfort zone. Maybe we're just used to writing our variables like that and just using them as a constant. Because they have been around here for years. These custom properties, I think, 7 years? I don't know, maybe, 7 years? It's been a long time. So, maybe they're just easy to learn and hard to master. Because these custom properties can do a lot of things. They can be overwritten, they can have a fallback, they can contain anything, and I can't stress this enough, they can contain anything you want, and they can be controlled with JavaScript, which can lead to some very cool effects. And for that effect, or the basics of it, I created a little case called the button case. Inspired by a talk I saw about 2 years ago of Leah Veru, who did something with a button, and was, this is interesting. So I kind of took that example and went a bit further of it. So we're going to create a button. Well, we're going to create 4 buttons. More specifically, these 4 buttons. They all have a nice, beautiful hover state, as you can see. They're not your most fancy buttons, I agree, but you've kind of seen this kind of button system before on websites, right? You have a primary button, secondary button, and some outline variants. They're all around in different design systems. This is the HTML of it. Also, quite straightforward. Some class names in there for secondary button, an outline button, and an outline secondary button. And they also have some default styles, which I'm not going to repeat the whole time because it's not really a part of where I'm going with this. So they have some padding, some border radius, they have a cursor pointer, and they have a very, very lazy transition, all because it's a demo. That's okay. So in the past, you would probably write a Sass mixin for this. And you can see on the left-hand side how you create such a Sass mixin. And the benefit of something like this, or your styled component equivalent, is that you can really easily create new buttons. As you can see on the right-hand side, you just create a button, let that little mixin do its work, and this would actually give you these 4 buttons. And the output code, because Sass is a preprocessor, is the following. And this is kind of where it hurts for me, because that's actually a lot of code if you look at how CSS can be modern these days. Because we're constantly overwriting these colors and background colors and border colors based on our cascade, so maybe there's a smarter system to do this. Something lightweight. Maybe, yeah, something that is also easy to manage and easy to expand, as we could do with that Sass function, right? Just create a new button, create a new button. We want that thing, but then in CSS. So the first thing you have to do to create something like that is think about the common factor. What do all these buttons have in common? Does anyone want to take a guess? Let me try some interactivity. Nobody? A guess? They all change color. When you hover over a button, they change color. Doesn't matter to me if it's a background color, or a border color. Doesn't matter, but they do change a color. So how can you create your filled buttons? By using custom properties. That's better, thanks. You could do something like this. You can set it up like this. So first of all, we're going to add a custom property, and we will scope that to our button. Hence there, the color custom property black. Now we're going to read that custom property inside of our background and our border, giving us the color black for our primary button. Now, how are we going to handle our hover states now? Instead of actually redeclaring properties, we're just going to use that custom property. And we're going to say, hey, now the variable on hover is color dark cyan. And for the secondary, the color is now secondary. And for the secondary hover, that color is now purple. So just overriding that custom property the whole time. Already recreating these 2 buttons by just one single custom property. Small thing though, you could work, especially in bigger design systems, with a sort of a private variable. But this is not really a thing. It's more like a convention. There's no such thing as private variables in CSS yet. You never know what the future brings yet. But yeah, using the underscore is something that comes from the old JavaScript ways where we didn't have const and let before. We used underscores then. So now I'm using underscore to indicate that this is now a private variable. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read that color custom property inside of it, or make it fallback. This is the fallback after the comma to black, which will be our primary color. For the background and the border, I will now read that private variable. So actually, nothing has changed much. This is still pretty much the same code as before. It will still do the same thing. I'm just setting some things up for later on. Now, we have our fill buttons. How can we add our outline buttons into this equation? That's it. By just creating an outline variant that is background transparent, and then that color is now the private variable or private custom property named color. Recreating our 4 buttons. Now I kind of broke it down for you, so let me just show you the difference. We started out with the output of Sass. This was our code. Going with custom properties, this has been reduced to this. And it does exactly the same thing. But I agree, maybe Sass isn't the most modern solution these days, so maybe you want to use something different. I mean, I think this is a more modern approach these days, and if you would do that, you could get an output CSS, but I did add the paddings here as well, and this would be your output CSS. And this would be your output CSS page 2. And this would be your output CSS page 3. And you have just a little bit left at page 4. I don't have anything against Tailwind, but let's just look at this box for a few seconds. Please use what you want, but yeah, can do better. So we ended up with this. It's pretty short, but I was wondering, can we make this even shorter? 4 buttons. Can we make this less code? Well, we can. By introducing a second custom property for the hover. So now what I'm going to do is I did pretty much the same thing. The only thing that has changed first is the button secondary, where I'm introducing this hover color right here, which is now purple. And the other thing that changes at the bottom, I have this button default state that is hovered or focused. And in that case, the color will now change to the hover color or fall back to dark cyan, which is our primary button's hover color. With about 20 lines recreating these buttons. Now, let's take it a step further. Why did I do this? Now, I wanted the ease of use for Sass, so maybe you want to create a new button. So now you could just create a button orange, for example, and say this is the button orange. It has an outline variant as well. And the only thing you'll have to add is this little chunk of CSS, recreating also an orange button and an orange outline button. Now that's pretty smart. This is the styling of 4 buttons with about 20 lines of CSS. And it's easy to expand and easy to manage. There's a little pitfall though. You could get a bit of trouble with specificity and more about the cascade actually. Because if you would declare your orange button below the hover state, it would not work anymore. But of course there's something new here in CSS called cascade layers, which could potentially solve that issue. Non-layered styles in cascade layers come last, which would always make sure your hover is actually triggered. If you want to learn more about cascade layers, I'd like to refer to Maarten, who gave the introduction. He has an excellent talk about that. But you can do a bunch of things with these custom properties. This was just the start. You can now access these things in line. You can override this color by adding this inline chunk of style. Maybe you have this one very special button that you just want to give a color and it's never going to happen again. You could add it like this. Or you could use some JavaScript. Sorry about the color hinting, something went wrong there, sorry. But you could say, this .style.set property will actually set a custom property. Now what I'm going to do here, I'm using an HSL color function, and I'm going to do a random number in a 360-degree coloring wheel. I'm going to give it a fixed saturation and lightness, and this will give me a nice little button that changes hue every time you click it. Fun, right? I don't know why you would use it, but it's just cool that you can do it. So that's it for buttons. But buttons is just a very small part of the things we do every day. We make grids, right? It's part of the things we do the most. We create grids, especially as a front-end developer, I create a lot of grids. But we can also do something like this, which is our theming. Light and dark themes, very popular these days to do. With custom properties, you can make this quite easy. You can just set your constants, root variable colors like this, and then you would just check for the dark scheme. And in that case, change your colors on that. And now you can already reference these previously declared constants, which makes it pretty strong, by saying, hey, this is my color darkest, which is referencing to the color darkest, which you can find right there. So pretty handy. But how about some smart grids? This is a very interesting technique I saw earlier this year, where actually there were some constants set for the column minimum width, and also a gap, which was set. Now, next thing that happened was in a different layer, not that important though, they set a grid utility class. And this has a minimum that also inherits that previously set constant. It also has a gap that inherits a previously set gap. And then this is a little technique in CSS which makes you a grid, to say it shortly. It actually says, hey, if you can fit 2 items of, in this case, 400 pixels next to each other, in that case, keep placing them and otherwise make them a width of 100% and make it smaller. In short, creating a grid that looks like this without the use of media queries. There's some container query stuff going on there that's not that important, but you can see the idea of the grid itself very well, right? But what's the strength about this? What if you kind of want to create another grid that's only about 300 pixels wide and has a gap of 20 pixels, something different? Well, it's pretty easy. You could just say, hey, this is my grid. I add a product grid, and I overrule these two custom properties. And now you would have that other grid. You can also do this for Flexbox. Now, the idea of this grid is not mine. This was, I saw this technique by Stephanie Eccles earlier this year on CSS-tricks. And I really suggest you check it out. It has some really interesting techniques in modern CSS in it. So shout out to her. If you really want to learn more about the grid techniques itself, I just wanted to have it about the custom property part of it. But there are also alternatives. If you want to write something different, you could do something like this. No, let's not go there. Let's just look again to the beautiful fox this time. I'll get there. I'll get there. But first about animation. But I'll get there. So, using for animation. Imagine you want to do the following. You want to create this nice, cool, little swirly pager. Looks quite fun, right? In the past, you'd probably say, hey, let's just use some JavaScript for that. It's not needed anymore. You can do this with CSS. So let's start off with some basic HTML, which is your unordered list. Notice the little title I have in there. This will be important later on. And I also have the number 1. Why is this? It's a little tip I give you. If you would hover over the A element itself and it would bounce up, you would lose your hover and you get this nice, cool animation jank. So I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to animate a before pseudo element in this case. So yeah. Which is going to read that attribute title, by the way. This is why I get my numbers visible as well. What about custom properties? First thing I did is I set 3 custom properties on my pager, move 0, move 1, and move 2. These have a sort of decrement going on, right? Some numeral decrement. And then I added my little pseudo element for the before, and I gave it a move of 0. This will be the default custom property here, move 0, and a lightness of, what is it, 18%? Yeah, 18%. Of course, I'm going to transition the transform because I'm going to move it up, and I'm going to change the background as well because it lights up when you hover it. Now, the background will be an HSL color space, and I'm just going to animate that lightness, which is one of these custom properties. And for my transform, I will move it up based on that move custom property, as you can see right here. Of course, this will be 0, 0 times minus 65% is 0, so it will just stay at the bottom at default. So how I'm going to animate this? With a bit of help of new CSS techniques with has. So first of all, the first one is pretty simple. If my A element is hovered or focused, in that case, the before should change to move 0. So this move will get inherited and it will be placed up. Also, the lightness will change, which will be 45%. Now, the second selector is a bit tricky, but bear with me. The first part is I'm going to check the sibling before the item that is hovered. So this is going to be, does the list item have next to it a list item that is hovered or focused? Then this one's A before should move to 1. The second part of that selector is the item, the sibling right next to it, which is if the list item has a hover or a focus state, then the list item next to it before must move 1. So these items will move to 1. The last part is actually quite the same thing. I'm just checking it double time here, adding 2 pluses in there. Recreating this complete effect by just a handful of custom properties. Pretty sweet. And remember, they can contain anything you want. That's quite an important thing. Think about the following. Maybe you want to play around with colors. So if you just add some numeric values in there, slap an RGB function around it, the browser will understand this. This will actually return that color right there. So now if you want to use some alpha transparency in that, you could add a comma and add some alpha transparency in an RGBA function. Now, truth be told, with new CSS features coming soon. This probably won't be needed as much anymore, but it's still fun to do. And another thing we can do is check for progressive enhancement. Remember, anything you want, so adding a space in a custom property is a valid value. If you would check for in OKLab, for example, these are our new color spaces in CSS, which is awesome. They give these really beautiful colors. If you could check out in OKLab and you had a space by default as a constant, and then you will check with a support flag, hey, do you have a linear gradient support for in OKLab? In that case, change that custom property to in OKLab equals in OKLab, comma. Do not forget the comma, it's quite important there. Now, if you will have your gradient helper class, you could say, hey, this is a linear gradient, and you check out this custom property, which will return in OKLab, comma, for the browsers that support it, or will just be an empty space for the browsers that don't support it. So you have a nice progressive enhancement, giving you, the screen doesn't really do it justice, but you have an OKLab versus not OKLab in that case. But yeah, think outside of the box, and that's what I was kind of referring to. Like, you could also do this for other things. Think about using them for different transitions based on mobile or other things like that. You can optimize it that way. You can also think about using them for paddings, of course, and you can also use them in keyframes, which can be handy because you could reuse your animations a lot more. And I'm a really big fan of using them by three: CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. The Holy Trinity, big fan of it. And you can use the platform these days for a lot of things because it's stronger than ever. You can use JavaScript to update a lot of custom properties inside of your DOM. You could use your CSS that actually reads these things in your HTML, and then you can just use CSS to create a lot of magic. So, combining them with JavaScript, look at this little cool example. It's a little sun that follows my cursor. It's quite fun, right? Turns out it's not that hard to do this anymore, because it all starts with a div. Front-end tutorial 101, create a div. And add an ID to it, which is the sun, because we're going to move the sun. And my sun will be position fixed. It will have a width, it will have a height, and we will transform it. Now, this transform will have two custom properties, one for the x and one for the y axis. Next up, and we're going to fall them back to 0. I'd say that as well. The only thing we have to do is get our client x of our mouse move event, get that sun as well, and divide that to the middle. So we have the middle point of our sun for x and y, and then just set these custom properties inside of HTML. This would animate that sun. The shadow, something different, but it kind of works with the same custom properties I've said before. All my demos are on the last slide, and I will share my slides. So if you want to check it out and do a deep dive in how these things work, no problem. And pretty much with the same technique, I created a theme selector. I thought this one was quite fun to build. You can just change theme based on something you select. It's not completely on there, but it's good enough. And also has a little border radius check. Like you see, the first item is changing border radius when you click the checkbox. The second item doesn't. I'll get back to that. But that's pretty fun. So now we're taking a bit more of a deeper dive. We're going to use a lot of inheritance here. So I have color H, which will be my hue. I will be using HSL color again, hue, saturation, and lightness. And this will be default to 0, or the H custom property. The same will happen for my color L, which will be my lightness, default 50. And then I'm using another custom property, theme color, where I'm just going to read these items inside of. That's perfect. So then I have my little demo stage, a nice article in there with a button in it. And of course, my article will have that background variable theme color, which will return that HSL color. Now, then, next up, I just created that select, and you have these values inside of them that represent a hue. So these are items on the hue color wheel, and the only thing left for me to do is when I select something, I will change that H custom property every time, changing the hue, changing that other one, changing the last custom property, and finally return that new theme color. That's all it takes. Now you might be thinking like, hey, but your buttons change as well here, so that's not really true what you're saying. Well, that's where the other custom property came from. I manipulated my lightness for each of these buttons. So also on hover state. So they have another shade of that hue that I already selected. That's how I created those. But what about that border radius checkbox? Well, custom properties can contain anything you want, so you probably don't need JavaScript to do this. Yes. So if you would add something like this in a custom property, that is a valid value. Custom properties can contain anything you want, so false. Why not? Next up, there's something new coming on, which is our container style queries. Now, container style queries, currently supported in Chrome and Edge, will check if a certain value of a custom property is valid. So we can check, hey, inside of my container, in my parent, is border radius or set border radius set to true? Do something inside of that. And with has, as you've seen before, we can actually check if a checkbox is checked by our root. Let me break it down. I just created a little input with the class name checkbox. And then I set some new custom properties. The first one below my HSL trickery being border radius 0 and set border radius to false. Then my article and my button will have a border radius reading that border radius custom property. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to use has and actually check, does my root have a checkbox that is checked? In that case, change the custom property to set border radius true. With my container style query, I can actually read this, saying, hey, is this true? In that case, give the demo stage a border radius custom property of 10 pixels, recreating this pure booleans in CSS. I think that's so cool. Now, I wouldn't overuse this. It's probably not the best idea to do this, but it's fun that you have the chance if you want to. But be creative, because there are so many things you can do. With this exact same technique, I created a little LCH slider. Just the same technique, changing the colors while you are actually sliding different parts of the LCH color wheel. It's pretty fun to do. And the last thing I want to talk about real short is add property. So add property is part of the CSS Houdini spec, is the spec? Well, part of a bunch of APIs. And it will allow developers to actually type these custom properties, because I know contain anything you want, and that's kind of contrast to how we like things these days. We like TypeScript, right? Everybody wants things typed, so you could type your custom properties then. But this also adds a few benefits. For example, the following. If by default you would like to animate a hue wheel inside of an HSL, you cannot do that, because CSS doesn't know what's going on there. What should you animate? What is this thing you want to do? Why do you want to spin this? The browser doesn't know. But with add properties syntax, we can do a few things, saying, hey, this H custom property is an angle. Telling the browser this is an angle, and its initial value is 0 degrees. And you can also choose whether it inherits from a previous one or not. So these things together can give you actually the chance of a rotating hue wheel, creating cool hue changing effects. But you can also use that for rotation of gradients. The sky's the limit, it opens a window of possibilities. So, custom properties. There's one thing I wanted to show you today, and I think I did, is that they are so much more than constants. And you can really create some smart systems with them. Just put your mind to it, and you got this. I believe in all of you. And the best thing is, they remove dependencies. Don't just jump right away to JavaScript, maybe you can do it with custom properties, especially when it comes to animating things. That's really important because you will remove dependencies. And removing dependencies means a win for your performance. Custom properties are awesome. And if you are still not using custom properties, I hope that after today, you'll change that right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brecht. Does anyone have any remarks, any questions in the room? I heard one question. Maybe good to repeat that? Okay.
I kind of gave an answer.
Yeah, tailored to your the slides were tailored to your question.
Yes. And with custom properties, you can really make that a lot easier by just using media queries and overwriting those. So, yeah.
Great. Yeah, cool.
Hi, thanks. I have two questions about custom properties. One of them is, would you use inherit false in add property to disable inheritance for those private properties, such as underscore color?
That could be a good use case. Yeah, sure.
Because personally, I'm a bit worried sometimes that they might end up in other components that are nested inside of them.
Yeah. That's probably why you would want to do that. Like, you really don't want, especially if you're working with third parties inside of your company, which happens a lot, that they override your things. Like, maybe you want to block that. Yeah, absolutely.
My concern, though, is that maybe browser support is great in my browser, but then it does break in other browsers where it still inherits.
Depends. Like, if we're talking about has and the container style queries, yes, these are currently only supported in Chrome mostly.
Add property, I mean.
Oh, add property, yeah. Yeah, Firefox is coming though. So they will do it, that's already been known. But for now, you're stuck with Chrome and Edge and Safari. But of course, in some cases, you could do it as a progressive enhancement as well, especially when it comes to nifty things such as a hue gradient that's rotating or whatever. In that case, you could do it for a little fun side thing on the side.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, for now, I'm just prefixing it with the component name still, just to be sure.
Yeah, sure.
My last question is, are there situations in which you would prefer to use like a private color property over current color?
Oh, oof, that's an interesting question. So you're actually asking me if I use current color instead of a custom property?
Yeah, I still use current color, but
yeah,
I'm
but
wondering if I'm missing out.
That's a good use case as well. Yeah, sure, I would. Wouldn't fix for the button case, for example, I think, but yeah, I use current color as well. Especially handy if you use the HTML dark theme check, then it gets automatically white or black depending on your color scheme. That's, yeah, I would use that.
Okay,
Absolutely.
thank you very much. What's the question over there?
Yeah, mine was relating to, you said that you could basically put anything in a custom property.
Yeah.
So you had that example where you needed to end it with a comma because afterwards there was not a custom property coming, which made me think it was doing not much more than some string replace.
Oh, no. So the reason I did that is because the syntax of that gradient is in OKLab, comma, and then the other colors are after it. So you need the comma to actually just create a correct syntax of that gradient. That's why you need the comma there, and otherwise an empty space, because then there would be nothing and just throw an sRGB gradient.
I like that. So yeah, because the add property made me see, okay, it is smart. It's not just replacing a string.
No, I just really just said, I'll put this in OKLab, comma in this case. So that's the only thing it actually did. Actually, it is quite dumb system for something very smart. That's the idea behind it. Yeah.
All right. Thanks. Any more questions?
I was wondering about the example of a button where you have different variants, like a secondary or an outline variant.
Mhm.
Regarding like specificity, is there any way I can say that a particular variant has to have, precedence over another variant, or do I have to use important then?
Or cascade layers. That's your other bet, I guess. No, but I'm not sure I follow why you would do that.
Well, I'm wondering if it's like a complete, if I can replace, for example, right now we're using Tailwind with Tailwind merge. And you can say like, these are my base rules. And then on top of that, I always want to override them with these other rules. So I can give a precedence in that way.
Oh, yes. That's, yeah, so you want to do this after Tailwind. You could, or you could, a few things. You could add your whole Tailwind inside of a layer and do the other things out in another layer. That's one option you can do it. Then the specificity will be higher. The other thing you could do is fake a higher specificity in your cascade by adding them last, or adding some wrapper around it, or a higher class, or I don't know. I think those are your only options in that case.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Right, okay. Yeah, so then for every override, I have to add another like specificity variable.
It won't be, you won't have an easy way. That's kind of the short answer for it. You will have to do some manual labor to get that working. That's a fact.
Yeah, I'm still looking for this like complete solution for variants. Like I want to be able to specify which variants override properties from another variant. And if everything is just a class, then there's not really a good way to do it.
Okay. Yeah, for me this works, but yeah, maybe that's because I don't use Tailwind that much. So
no, it's not. It's not even related to Tailwind, but maybe let's talk about it after.
Okay, sure.
Right.
And with that, the microphone is back this way.
Right.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're gonna have a little break. I think 15 minutes, and then it's up to Hidde. So please, network talk. Any complex questions? Any new code pens, maybe? In 10 minutes? Ooh, that's pretty rough. Okay, but let's have a drink and see you in a bit. Hey. Hello. Oh, there it is. Hey, hi everyone. Yeah, I could stand here, but I could also stand here. Hope you enjoyed the first talk. Really went deep into custom properties. I really like custom properties myself. Oh, that was a question I forgot. Are we already to replace SAS yet? Oh, you think so? Spicy take. There you have it, kids. But for our next speaker, we're going to do a little bit more than CSS. I think we're going to talk about HTML and stuff like that. Okay. I'm going to unmute you so that everybody at home also can hear you. And then we're going to start. So give it up for our next speaker, who works at the NL design system, accessibility expert. Yes, it's Hidde!
Yay! Yay, thanks all for staying as well, except for my colleagues who just left, but they've already seen the talk, it's fine. They hear me talk about popovers all the time. I just wanted to check one thing, because we are in Eindhoven, and I found on Google that some people call this Los Angeles. Anyone? No, it doesn't seem to be a thing. I asked one Eindhoven person I know, and he said no. In 41 years, he's never heard of anyone referring to Eindhoven like that. It was on some website about Eindhoven, like 10 fun facts you should know. I don't know. I never heard of it either. What I have heard about... Yeah, use it from now on. Make it a new thing, right? Yeah, I think that's fair. One thing I have heard about is Yorkshire puddings. Are you familiar with those? Yeah, if you visit the UK on a Sunday, you can eat this thing called Sunday lunch or Sunday roast. And what they do is they roast vegetables and meat or vegetarian things, and they serve Yorkshire puddings with them. Here's one on the right. They're very nice. What I didn't know is that they are called popovers in the US. And you can watch videos about them as well. Is this on America's Finest Cuisine or something like that? And they say popovers can be real tricky. It's true. We're about to find out. Custody inside, I cannot promise that for this talk, but it's a fun video if you want to know how to make them. My colleagues who are just here, they promised me that they are going to make me popovers because they bought popover equipment. So I will be able to enjoy these sometime in the future when they are ready for it. But this talk is really about other things. It's about content that overlaps other content, and that's very common on the web. It's not always great. Like, there's overlapping content like ads that are really somewhat in the way. There is stuff that asks you to register for a website, cookie consent thingies, and sometimes they even put like a newsletter overlay right on top of all of that, and it's ridiculous. It's really annoying. This is the type of popover that I don't personally like very much. And as you can see in this example, is that their overlay is actually underneath their cookie consent thing, so they have a layering thing going on there. We use too many modals in general, I think. I don't know if you're aware of this website. It's modals.com, or modals with a Z. And it explains in a lot of detail why you should not be using any of these things. And I'll still be talking about them today, but I won't be talking about why you should use them. I'm not going to try and convince you, but I know that you are probably building them at home or at work. This is happening, so I want to give you some ways that are maybe going to make that easier. And specifically, there are two things that are in the HTML standard called dialog, the dialog element, and the popover attribute. Now, dialog element is fairly standard now. It's in all the browsers. It's accessible. Somewhat it wasn't very accessible before, and they fixed a lot of accessibility bugs. So it's somewhat ready for usage. And then there's the popover attribute, which is in Chrome and Edge and Safari, and in Firefox behind the flag, which is nice, so it's somewhat available. I encourage you to play around with that, but don't use it in production yet before thorough testing, because there are still accessibility issues to be ironed out. They're somewhat ironed out in Chrome and Edge, I do have a blog post about that coming out. They are not so much ironed out in Firefox and Safari, so we need to wait for that actually. So I'll talk today about some UI considerations, some semantics, as well as positioning, which is interesting when you are looking at dialogues and popovers, because it works a bit differently than what you might expect. So my name is Hidde. I work at the NL Design System core team at the Dutch government. I'm also a participant in OpenUI community group, which if I wasn't here, I would have been there with Brecht. He's always there. We spend our Thursday evenings in this group. And maybe other times, I don't know. I also have my own blog that you can like and subscribe to. It's on hidde.blog, which is a domain name I got specifically for making it a bit easier to talk about it. It used to have a much longer URL. So I'll give you some examples of popovers to get you in the mood. So here's a popover I got when I got the new Slack. Does anyone have the new Slack yet? They've made interesting choices, and I get lost sometimes now to find DMs and notifications, and I think they're still ironing some stuff out. But what they're doing here is they are teaching you about their new thing. That is something that popover is commonly used for. So they display a popover on top of the UI to tell you what's different about it. Popovers aren't always used for very good things. Microsoft Teams famously uses it to ask for feedback. I get this all the time. I work at the government. We're forced to use Teams, and it's sometimes okay, and it's sometimes somewhat annoying when it's asking for feedback while you're trying to chat to your colleague. It does worse things because Microsoft, I don't know if you know, they make a lot of products, right? They don't just make Teams. They also make Microsoft Excel. And they like to bother you about that while you're in a serious business meeting. So they'll go, do you want to use Excel? Do you want to use our integration with Excel? I don't really like it. It's a user popover that I think is not great. The other day, they also asked me if I want to be my expressive self. By creating an avatar. Didn't do it, but that's something that I also do while, again, you're waiting for something important to happen. I prefer what Slack does, something we also use at work. They have a popover that tells you look nice today, and they don't even check, right? There is no camera footage involved. It just tells you whenever you hover over yourself. I like that. It's a good detail. This is, of course, kind of having fun with the UI for them. There's also popovers that are somewhat more serious. Like in your banking environment, you'll have combo boxes. Like we're building these all the time, I guess. Like when you're searching for stuff, the results show on top of other content. Date pickers, they also show on top of other content. And there's lots of elements like that. Some of them are dialogue, some of them are popovers, some of them are both. So in this talk, and I hope you go away with some kind of broad understanding of what the difference is between these, especially when we talk about how that works in HTML. So a dialogue, I'll start with that, and then I'll go into what a popover is. So a dialogue is an additional window to your main window. It's like an extra window. It could be its own sort of website. It's an extra thing, a sub-window. Usually it contains an action, a task, some critical information. It could be a conversation between you and the system, or between the system and their users. Stuff like, oh, you are in this document, you're opening a new one. What do you want to do with the current one? So you want to know stuff from the user, and you need to know it right then and right there. That's dialogues, and dialogues have their own HTML element. As mentioned, it's the dialogue element, and it's an element to build dialogues. And you can open that with scripts. So if you find your dialogue element in the DOM, you can call show modal, and you'll open it with a modal mode. So it means that the browser is going to do all the modal stuff for you. And I get into detail what modals are, but just to say there's also a show method, which will make it non-modal. So you get these two different variants based on which method you use. When you call show, it's non-modal. When you call show modal, it's modal. At this point, I should point out that there is three different things that we're talking about here. There's a dialogue element, which comes with that modal setting. It comes with keyboard behavior, comes with semantics, lots of stuff. There's also the role of dialogue that you can add and see in your code bases. That's a different thing. It's just the semantics, so it's just the role of what this thing is in the page. And then there's dialogue just a word, which is something we might be using all the time in like conversations with colleagues, and it might not be either of these things. So you could build a dialogue without adding that role or without using that element, which wouldn't be good, but that's just a difference I think is important to point out. Like when you're talking about dialogues or when you're talking about actual dialogues in the browser. Now, dialogue is super well supported. It's supported across all of the major browsers. And there are some accessibility issues. I recommend this post by Scott O'Hara. I will be sharing my slides afterwards, so you can find the link there as well. But it basically talks about why it's okay today to use the dialog element, and it links to a previous post where he talked about why it wasn't okay at the time and explains kind of what was wrong with it. Moving on to popovers, they are a piece of supplemental UI, right? That are contextual, they are non-modal, transient, and there is a popover attribute that adds the popover behavior for you. So popover attribute will do that for you. And there's a bunch of different behaviors that you could count under that. So it's things like dismiss, keyboard behavior, top layer presence, and auto closure of other popovers. The browser would do all of that for you once you add the popover attribute to your element. So all of these things, they kind of come built into the browser, and you don't need to build them yourself anymore. And in fact, with top layer presence, you can't build them yourself because the browser is only going to allow you to have that when you use popover or modal dialogues. So popovers are used for elements that are put on top of other page content. They're not always visible, and usually they are displayed one at a time. They are used quite a bit now. Quite a bit, 0.3% of page loads already uses it in Chromium-based browsers. I assume this number is going up, but it means that some people are using them. Like this website called github.com, they are on there. And you can see that, so you can inspect it in the browser and see that they not only use the popover attribute, but also that these elements are in the top layer. So there's a top layer badge that tells you about that. They're also coming to Photoshop in the browser. I don't know if you've seen this, but they've built Photoshop in the browser with web technology, which I think is kind of cool. They use web components for that, and they are also working on adding popover in there. So popover is used for things like content pickers, form element suggestions, action menus, list boxes, and as I mentioned all the way at the start, teaching UI as well. So all these different things can be used for popover. So popover can be used for all of these things. And the cool thing is that you don't actually need JavaScript. So when you have a button and you have a div, you can turn that div into a popover by adding that popover attribute. That's the moment where that happens. So attribute added, it's now a popover. It will be in the top layer, and it will get hidden by default until it's shown. Now, when you add an ID to it and you refer to that ID from the button with the popover target attribute, you're pointing at the popover, and that makes that button a toggle for the popover, which means that you don't actually need any JavaScript for that toggling to happen. I think that's kind of cool, and someone named Keith Circle is working on taking that sort of stuff to more elements and more things, so that you could also open dialogues and other elements without JavaScript. And that's kind of cool. It's not necessarily because of kind of a hatred for JavaScript, like JavaScript is great. It's just good to be able to do these things without relying on your own JavaScript, because it allows you to ship much smaller bundles, for instance. So you can also use the popover target action attribute that allows you to say specifically that your button should not be toggling, but it should be just showing or just hiding, so you can control the kind of behavior. And you can add a value to the popover attribute, like auto or manual. Auto is the default, so if you don't add it, you still get auto. That will close other popovers, and it will have light dismiss. Whereas if you set it to manual, which is what the GitHub example did, then it won't close other things, it won't have light dismiss, and you also need to open it manually. You can open it manually. You can do that with element.showPopover, so you call the showPopover element or method on it. It's a bit like that show modal or show method that comes with dialog. So that just allows you to show it whenever you like. For instance, on GitHub, they do that on hover. It's something you can't do out of the box yet, so you can just listen to that hover method and then call show popover. Okay, so the current status is that it's in Safari, higher than 17, so it's not on everyone's Safari. Reminder of that, and it's in Firefox behind the flag, so you can play with it in any of your favorite browsers. Now, one of the things that I realized when I was sitting in these meetings, me and Brecht were both sitting in those, listening to all these people talk about, okay, non-modal dialogue, popover, hiding, showing, it kind of started to dazzle me. How are these things actually different? Like, what are the differences between these patterns that we're discussing? Because it seems like a lot of these popovers are also dialogues, and they are somewhat similar. So I came up with a bunch of different axes on which they are very different, and I hope that helps to kind of understand. The first one being modal versus non-modal. So something is modal when it is the only thing that you can interact with on a page. So let's say there is a cookie consent thingy because you've placed cookies, or you want to place cookies, you want to track your users, you need to ask their permission. It makes sense to only do that when you're actually sure that they've given permission. Not only does it make sense, it's probably what you legally need to do. So then in that case, it makes sense to say you cannot access anything else on the website. You can just access this thing, make your decision. It's not necessarily a great user experience, but it's necessary because you need their permission. Another example is something that we see on a lot of government websites here in the Netherlands. You get a timeout after 15 minutes when you've logged in with the Digity login method. So again, you need to tell people about that you are about to be logged out, because they might be in the middle of like a tax return, press the submit button, and then find out that they're logged out. That's not a great experience. You need to tell them, we've got 5 more minutes, you are about to be logged out, and then do that. So again, it makes sense to kind of have that the only thing that they can interact with. It's not great because they were interacting with something else. They probably don't want to be disturbed, but it's very important because their session, it's going to time out. It's a bit like an alarm clock in the morning. Like you are woken up by your alarm clock, you don't like it, but you kind of have to because you need to go to work and stuff like that. So it's just necessary that is so much in the way. Game over screens are a different example because you can't actually go back to the game. There's no way. You can only go back and start the game again, but the game itself is going to be blocked out for you because, sorry, you're dead, you're game over, you can't go back to these different things. Then some examples of non-modal dialogues. It's, for instance, this one where there's a bunch of links that display on top of the page and you can still interact with everything else on the page. Image description boxes, menus, chatbots. It's rather annoying if you could only interact with the chatbot, like you want to interact with everything else on the page. So that's basically the difference. Can you interact with everything else, or do you just get access to the modal thing itself? So making something modal is a drastic measure. Only do that when you absolutely have to. Like when the user session is about to time out or when you're about to track them, you need to do that. Then another axis on which popovers and dialogues are different is the dismissing. So there's something called explicit dismiss, which basically means that you press a button or that there is some way that you need to do in order for the thing to go away, like you need to press a close button. Light dismiss means that something is going to be dismissed automatically. So maybe you're selecting a font and then you start scrolling or you kind of go and do something else and that thing just disappears. And that's fine. Like you would expect that to go away and you would not expect to have to click a button for that to go away. So that's light dismiss. Then there's different layering, z-index versus top layer. So when you use z-index for layering, you're basically saying this item has to go on top of that other item. So you're using a number as the z-index value in order to decide what the order of rendering is. Because if two things are in the same place in CSS, you get this way. Otherwise, you would just render in the order of the document, which is why many people put their dialogue elements just before the closing body tag, because then it's at the end, and then you have most chance that it will kind of be at the top. But with z-index, you can control that fully. With the top layer, you get a whole different layer. So this is basically a layer that lies on top of all of your HTML documents. So even the highest z-index will still be underneath your top layer. So top layer is this kind of magic place that's always on top of everything else. And you can see that in your DevTools as well. It shows as top layer and it shows as kind of a sibling almost of the HTML elements. Now you might be wondering, how do I control the order within my top layer elements? You can't actually use z-index for that, but you can use the ordering in which you add things to the top layer. So the first element that gets added to the top layer will be underneath the second one, because the second one goes on top. So when you want to change the order of your elements, you need to add them all over again, and then do it in the order that you want them to appear. So it's the order of appearance. Then there's backdrops. They're very common for elements that are modal, because if you can't interact with the rest of the page, it makes sense to also visually make that kind of unavailable and kind of hard to see. The top layer elements all get a backdrop built in that you can style with CSS, which is kind of cool. See, I still have some CSS in here. A backdrop is what you can use for that. So colon backdrop, you can make it pink or blurry or whatever you want to do. Background images, maybe. So a keyboard focus trap is the last thing where these things are somewhat different. Both modal and non-modal elements can have keyboard focus traps, but it's most common for modal elements. So focus trap basically means that someone cannot leave the thing that they are in. And that might seem a bit counterintuitive, like why would you block access? But sometimes it makes the user experience better. So like when you're in a modal element, and you press the tab key, it makes sense that you can't tap behind it because you can't even see behind it. So you would end up in this place you can't see. Not very helpful. And that's also something you might do when you build like a calendar widget where you don't want people to tap outside of the calendar because that would make them kind of lose where they were. So there are some use cases where you want to do that. It's always temporary. So let's look at how these different angles kind of relate to dialog and popover. So you get a modal element when you use a dialog with the show modal method. As I mentioned before, that's the only way that you can get something to be modal in the browser that is done by the browser. And it is also in some ways the only way you can do that. Like you can do some modality yourself as well with JavaScript and the libraries that help you do it. But there's a lot of stuff that you need to do manually. Like you need to make sure that everything that's not in the modal is also kind of blocked from access or inert, as they call that. Then you get something that's non-modal when you use dialog with the show method, and also when you use a popover, and basically anything else. So if you build a div that's absolutely positioned on top of something, it's also non-modal. Then light dismiss versus explicit dismiss. The only way to get light dismiss today is to use the popover auto, whereas everything else that you build, like a popover manual or a dialog or anything else, will be explicit dismiss. You need to build a button or like listen to key presses for people to close their elements. Then going to z-index versus top layer. So you get top layer only when you use popover or a modal dialog. There's no other way to get elements that are in the top layer. You can't use some library that will do that for you. That's the only way that's available. And then z-index is what you need to use when you use a dialog with show or any other element that is not one of those. Then backdrops, you get those for free with both the popover and with show modal. Although if you use it on popover on a non-modal dialog, you need to think twice, I guess, because if you're using a backdrop, you are blocking visually the rest of the page, so it kind of makes sense to then also make the whole thing modal. There are some use cases to not do that, but they're not super common. And then the last one is a keyboard focus trap. You get that for free when you use a dialog with show modal. So now that we kind of know what the difference is between these elements and kind of how they can be different, let's look at some semantics now. And semantics is something very common if you're familiar with web accessibility. It is what philosophers refer to as like, what is this thing? Basically the largest kind of philosophical questions people ask. The signs of semantic. Web developers have a somewhat more simple question, which is what is this thing in the page? And you'll have semantics in your pages all the time. Like when you use a heading, you get heading semantics. And this is used by screen readers. Like a screen reader can give you a list of all the headings that are on the page, and users can use that to navigate. So someone who is blind and they uses a screen reader, or they don't have to be blind for that to work, but that's what they would commonly use, is to navigate by heading. So they'll find all the headings on your page and then navigate directly to the heading that they want to go to. Very convenient way of navigating, and usually headings are good ways to see kind of what's on a page before you have to, like before reading everything that's on the page, right? You don't have time for that. When you use an anchor tag, you get link semantics. When you use list item tags, you get list item semantics. When you use a dialog, you get dialog semantics. You kind of get the point. All of these elements have semantics built in. The div element doesn't, and that's fine. Like sometimes you don't need semantics for a thing if they aren't semantic things. You can add also semantics to div elements, which is sometimes what people do. You can add a row of link to a div. It's somewhat frowned upon because then you also need to build in everything else that links do on the web. And there are some things that you can't actually build in with JavaScript, like you can right-click a link and open it in a new tab, and that's not something you can actually build with JavaScript, I don't think. Now, when you have a div and you add that popover attribute, you might think, okay, maybe it's going to add popover semantics for me. Except it won't, because the popover attribute only adds behavior and not semantics. That's a really important thing to keep in mind when you use popover. Initially, one of the ideas was for popover to be its own element. It was pop-up at the time, so it would have a popover element. But then when we started to think about what the semantics of that would be, we realized there are actually lots of semantics that match popover behavior. Hence the idea of maybe popover is more of a behavior than a semantic. Now, this means that when you use popover on a div or on any kind of element, you need to add the semantics yourself. And that's fine. So I want to take you through some of the possible semantics that I think make sense when you're using popovers. And the first one is, surprisingly, a dialogue. This is where some of my confusion started. Like, hey, I thought I was doing a talk about the difference between these two. But yeah, if something is a dialogue, like is an element that has kind of multiple interactive things in it, it's like its own window. Like in this case, there's a little window that allows you to select the exact passengers that are in your train carriage. And I've actually cut out a lot of HTML elements in order to take this screenshot. This is for the train to Vienna, or it says Berlin, but I think this is the Austrian railways. Has lots of buttons, lots of content, lots of stuff going on. That's usually a dialogue. Like it's a thing where you can make a decision, basically, where the user has to give some input. Teaching UI is usually a dialogue as well, especially if there's buttons involved. Mega navigations are also dialogues. They're not great, but they're dialogues as well. So dialogues is very common. Like there's lots of elements that kind of qualify as dialogue. So if you have those, you would add popover to either a dialogue element, which has dialogue semantics, or to some element that has a row of dialogue. Then list boxes, they're also quite common. They are basically elements that allow you to choose between a number of items. So the select element itself, if you would build that today, even if you were a browser developer, you would probably build that with the popover attribute, the kind of thing that pops out of a select element. And also if you build your own elements to do the same kind of thing. So when a user has to choose between different options, that's usually a list box semantic. And you can also have combo boxes that have list boxes inside of them. So they could be like a dialogue that has a bunch of options that the user then chooses from. So then the options themselves are a list box, but the popover is more of a dialogue because it's like a bigger thing. This can be somewhat confusing, but it's really important to make sure you get the right one because it sets a lot of expectations for users. And then another one is menus, which are basically when you press a button, something pops up and you get a bunch of buttons, like actions that you can do with a thing. A common example of that is when, say, you use Google Docs and you want to open the file menu. That's really like a menu. Importantly, your navigation is not a menu because that's a navigation. So when you have a bunch of links at the top of your page, that's not a menu. A menu is really like a bunch of actions that you have. So when you right-click on a page, you get options. Those are all kind of menu items there. And then the last semantic that I need to cover is tooltips, which are basically the kind of things that you see here. So you hover over a button and some kind of black cloud goes above your button. That's a tooltip. Importantly, a tooltip is usually something that only has like a string of text. If it has more than that, like it's got a heading and a button and some links, it's not really a tooltip anymore. It's more of a dialogue that looks like a tooltip. So that's important to keep in mind because the expectation of a tooltip is that it's something that you could read out at once to the user when it's like hovered. Whereas with a dialogue, there's more structure here to be navigated. So there's a heading there, there's a button, there's stuff going on. So it's more than just a tooltip. So that leaves us with three different semantics, basically. Dialogues, menus, and tooltips that are all available to you when you're using popovers. And there could be more. I saw some more examples of like footnotes and some other things that have other semantics. So semantics are optional. You probably want to add them, especially if they fit nicely into these categories because, then it makes the whole thing a bit easier to use for users. So semantics, we have on the one hand the dialogue element. It has dialogue semantics for free, easy. And then there's popover where you get to choose your semantic and it can be lots of different things. Now from semantics, I want to move over to positioning. And there's a few things to say about positioning, but one is that both a modal dialog and a popover are centered by default. And the reason for that is that they appear in the top layer. As I mentioned, the top layer is kind of like a sibling of your HTML element, meaning that the stuff that's in the top layer is really kind of separate from the stuff that's not in the top layer. So when you have a button that opens a menu, then your menu is in the top layer, but the button is not. So if you want to relate them, you get into trouble. Now, I do some positioning on a website that I call log.hidde.blog. It's a section of my blog that has data about stuff I do in my free time. Like, I go to concerts and then I just display the concerts there. And it's like my playground for new HTML stuff to play with. So in this case, I have a bunch of concerts. I loop through them, and some of them have photos, as you might see. So what I've wanted to do is put a button on those photos so that when you click it, it opens a modal dialog with the photo in it. Bit of a convoluted use case, but I didn't want to build a banking application just to show this demo. So there's a dialog element inside of it. There's also a button that allows you to close it, a bit like I explained before. So I look for all the dialogues and I find the right one, and then I call, importantly, that show modal method on it. So that's the most important thing. I find a dialog, I call show modal on that element. It's going to show that as a modal dialog. And that's nice. So when I open that and I inspect it in my DevTools, I can see that it is in the top layer and it displays nicely in the center. And that's cool. I think for most cases of dialogues like this, makes a lot of sense that it goes to the center because it kind of takes over all of your screen. It would be weird for it to be anywhere else, I guess, than in the center. So you can see how that looks in the DevTools. I can see it's in the top layer. There's a backdrop that I can style. I've actually given it some blur as well. So that kind of works for me. Modal dialogs go to the center. That's kind of cool. Popover, however, also goes to the center, and I'll show you why that's weird. I have another website with books where I try to build some filters, and that's more of like a menu that I wanted to build there. So I want to press that show filters button, and then I want that to show a menu that's somewhat nearby. But surprise, surprise, if I put in those buttons in my DOM, they are going to show up in the center, and that's because they're in the top layer. I went to ask the Chrome devs, like, why didn't you make it go close to my button? Because, you know, that's kind of where they belong. It makes more sense. And they said they don't know because this is the user agent style sheet that you're seeing here. So the way that that's positioned is by the user agent style sheet. It says go to the center because that's kind of the only place that they have available. There's a margin auto, which is cool, like it goes to the center. So they're both centered by default, and there are only two ways that you can kind of deal with that and make them close to where you want them to be, to that button, which is where you want most menus to be. The first one is to use a library. So you can use something like floating UI, which I've used here, find your element, and then whenever it's open, you need to find out where it needs to be, and then you set inline styles to the thing, and then it goes to the right place. That's something you can do. I did that for my demo thing, and it went to the right place. That kind of made me happy. It was a bit weird, though, because I had to also reset the margin and the position, because it somehow still had that auto margin around it. It might have been a Chrome bug. It was somewhat weird, but I also removed that from the user agent style sheet, overridden it in my own. The second thing you can do to position popovers, and maybe you've already heard of this, is anchor positioning. And when I say you can do, it's something you can do in the future. Because it is coming to browsers, it's being experimented with in Chromium, but it's not in other browsers, and there's also some disagreement about how exactly it should work. But what's going to be really cool about it is that you can tell the popover to be anchored to the button. So you can tell it, this is my button, this is my popover, these need to be anchored together. And that's really cool, because then you don't need to calculate where it needs to be. The browser will do it for you. And it will even do things like, oh, my popover only has space to go to the top or to the bottom or to the left or to the right, which is something that I, as a front-end dev, has spent too much time kind of worrying about and still kind of getting it wrong too, because I'm not very good at maths, so I always got kind of stuck, and I'm really happy that something like this is going to happen and help me do it kind of go automatically. What I want this to do, and it will do more stuff, but what I personally want it to do is just go near my button, and I don't really want to care where it goes. A bit like when I use the native select element, I don't care where it opens. The browser probably knows best where there is space. So I'm excited for this. It's coming, and I expect that to be like within the next year or so that we'll know how it's going to work and maybe potentially have some implementations. I don't have any influence on that, but I'm looking forward for that to happen. And I think especially for popover, that's going to be really good. Like the positioning libraries are okay, like they work, they're very effective. And you can write your own as well, and you can find ways around it. But yeah, it's going to be really cool to actually get this out of the box from the browser. With that, I want to wrap up. So we've talked about some UI considerations, semantics, as well as positioning, where semantics are a bit more tricky with popover, and positioning is also a bit more tricky with popover, but we'll get there. So some of the takeaways I want you to take away from this talk, one is that dialog and popover can massively reduce your JS bundle because there's lots of stuff that the browser will do for free for you, and things that the browser will do that they won't do for your libraries. Because you can only get them with those HTML features, unless your library uses those. Also, the popover attribute only adds behavior, not semantics, so you'll need to manually add that. Then popover and dialog with your modal are the only ways to get something into the top layer. And then lastly, I just want to say, don't use popovers to cross-sell your products. So if you happen to make a spreadsheet application as well as a chat application, don't mix them up. That's all I have for you today. Thank you very much, and I hope you have some questions as well.
Anyone with questions popping over their mind?
Yes.
I have a popping question. It's yes.
I haven't heard these before.
So it's about the top layer, and basically about the styling. The dialog, it eventually goes to that top layer. Will it still inherit styles as if it was in its original position in the HTML?
No, not positioning, because it doesn't know where it was originally, so it will be put in the center for you.
But all the other styles, your normal CSS selectors, for example, will still see it as if it's in that same location.
No, it won't know about its original location. And this is a bit weird because you don't see it in its original location. Like if you open it as a modal, then you'll not see it until it's open, right? So, but it will be somewhere in your DOM. It doesn't matter where it is in your DOM. It will always show in the center of your page.
Yeah, but I mean, if I have a dialog inside of a form element, and I have a selector that says form dialog,
yeah,
that will still keep working.
That will still work. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there also a like you have a colon root to select basically the top level element? Do you have something that selects everything?
I think there's a top level. I'm not sure. Maybe you know. I don't know if it exists or if there's just talk about it, because there could be multiple top layer elements. I believe we've talked about something like that, but I don't know if it actually exists.
Okay.
Yeah, because you could have a dialog in there and then another popover, or like 2 or 3 popovers. Like on GitHub, if you go to github.com and in the right top corner, they have a bunch of menus that also have tooltips. They both show in the popover. So if you look at your tooling, you can actually see top layer 1 and top layer 2 kind of distinguished there. So multiple things can sit in there. And I don't know if you can select them that way. There is a thing to select popovers that are open, I think. They're showing. Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
I have many questions. Yeah.
We'll start with the first one.
Yeah. So it's more like theoretical question. What do you think about it? So when I use my override, they give me options like, so I would like to stay logged in or no, I would like to log out. And if I click log in, it stays logged in. Everything works like it's supposed to be. But if I use my Gesundheit, it gives 2 options also. But if I click yes, I would like to stay in, I finish my sentence, and then it kicks me out. So probably it doesn't return right value, like answer from the user, or why it's different behavior? Because I see kind of the same.
So there's a lot of government websites that use the Digity login system, and they have their own ways of dealing with stuff. But the one thing they have in common is that they will be logged out after 15 minutes because that's how that service works. So there's no way, I guess, to be logged into any digitally powered website for more than 15 minutes. But every time you click a link, it gets extended. I think that's how it works. So the link, whenever it's served like from that domain, so any button click or anything you do on there, like it will extend your session again. So it's basically when you're idle for 15 minutes or maybe you're in your form, then you're extended. And I think maybe some websites will do it when you tap, they will do a call to the server or something to then extend it. But I don't know if that's allowed necessarily. I'm not sure how that, what all the technicalities of it are.
Yeah, so if I click at this form, yes, I would like to be logged in still. It doesn't read my behavior as activity.
It probably would, yeah. So but then if you wait 15 minutes, you'll still be logged out.
No, it's like after a minute or two after it, I
Yeah.
try to send a message and then it's kicked me out.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I don't know. That could be a bug. It sounds like, yeah.
Okay, this was my question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a small question, an accessibility question actually. I've also seen the role node being used for tooltip-like behavior. Could you explain that? Why would you use node as a role?
I've also seen it. I'm not actually sure when it's better than tooltip. One example I've seen for it is like when you have a note like in a scientific paper or something, like you're referring to some resource that's at the end of your document. I think that's a valid use case for Node, but I'm not exactly sure how Node and Tooltip are different. Maybe Node can contain more than just plain text, is my hunch.
Okay, so it's more about the kind of content you find inside of it than
Yeah, I
being just
think
text.
so.
Or,
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if they do anything differently specifically.
Okay, thank you.
What does the word modal mean? Because I've never heard it outside of this context.
Yeah, it's a great question. And as a non-native English speaker, I'm also not super sure. Like there are different modes. So like you're in one mode or a different mode. And I think in general, it's kind of like different contexts. So when it's modal, it's sticking to one specific context. I think that's the way to think about it. So yeah, when you're in a modal, you're not in another mode. You're like focused on one specific one.
Right, so it implies like it's exclusive. You can be in one mode at a time.
Yeah.
So if it's a modal dialogue, that means you can either be in the dialogue or not be in the dialogue.
Yeah. When you close it, you're no longer in it. But once it's open, like that's the only thing you get to interact with.
All right. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that if there's multiple elements in the top layer, the one that gets on top gets determined by the order of the elements.
Yeah.
Does it mean that the original order in the DOM is also the order that they appear in the top level? Or is there some other way to influence that?
No, the original place they appear in the DOM doesn't matter at all. So you could put one element at the start of your DOM and you could put one in the middle. It won't really matter for how they appear in the top layer. So they appear in order of when they are added to the top layer. So when the popover is shown, I guess, and when the show modal method is called on a dialog.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not sure when you would use it, but if you want to have a new element appear below the one that's already active, then you would first have to remove the old one.
Yeah, you need to take everything out and do it all over again. That's the only way that I know of. I'm not sure why Z-index isn't a thing like within that. Like you would get your own Z-index, but I think there are reasons for it because we've talked about it, and I'm not sure why it wasn't happening.
Thanks.
Two more questions to finish off.
Yes.
You have to help me debunk maybe this urban legend or this monkey sandwich, as we literally translate from Dutch. I heard that custom properties and top layer, it's kind of hard, or at least the backdrop. So I read this article about styling the backdrop with custom properties. Is it so? With custom properties, we want to place our custom properties in our root, our base custom properties, but the colon root does not apply to the double colon backdrop.
Yeah.
Is that true?
I can't debunk it because there might be truth to it. I'm not sure what the latest status is. Maybe you know, Brecht.
Did you done that?
I read the article that there were bugs with it, or it wasn't working at all, but I don't know what the status is.
Okay.
for it.
Okay. Maybe you had some inside information.
Sorry.
And the second question: did you enjoy yourself today?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Great to be here.
Well, thank you, Hidde, for sharing us the world of modals, dialogues, and popovers. Please be sure to go in dialogue with Brecht or Hidde after we round off the presentation and the live stream. There's still a few drinks left. We close in about a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, or like that. Is it okay if I put my laptop in?
Of course.
For a
Yeah.
few-
Yeah. Yeah. Let's take this one out.
I try to be all suave and make a great segue, but it's kind of hard. Where is it? So normally I stand there and other people talk, but now I have to do both jobs twice. So now I have to go to the laptop and push a button so that everybody can see this screen and this screen. And then I have to press other things to go full screen, but I won't do that because time. So first of all, I want to thank you for coming. Thank you. This meetup isn't possible with people like you coming over, sharing knowledge, having conversations. Super great. If you like this evening, please leave a review at our meetup page. And with that, I want to announce the last meetup of our meetup season, or the autumn-winter season. And that's we're going to end off with a workshop in collaboration with AWS. People at AWS are so kind to, again, team up with us and do a workshop. This time we're going to take a deep dive into the AI capabilities of AWS. So if you want to tinker around, if you want to have some objective knowledge on how AI works and what you can do, and if it actually suits your needs, well, this is an ideal opportunity to do that. AWS is going to provide us with some accounts, so you can set up an AI system, tinker around with it a little bit on their platform. It's a workshop that takes about 4 hours. We have a nice meal afterwards, some networking opportunities. So you're all happily invited. Also, the people at home now watching. 16th of November, same place, same faces, hopefully. And with that, thank you very much and have a great evening. That's all, folks.